Good evening and welcome back to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'm your host and narrator, Nancy Miller. And if you're new to the podcast, Dead Sleep is the only true crime podcast custom made for uninterrupted nighttime listening. Real life mysteries told mindfully, no gore, no graphic violence, maybe most important, no ads. Your support of this podcast with a subscription ensures that this podcast can continue and be successful. Now, this podcast isn't for everyone, and I admit I've gotten some strange looks when I've tried to explain it. That it's a podcast made for people who like to fall asleep to true crime and want well-researched true stories without graphic violence, especially violence against women or children. No. You want attention paid to audio quality and a soothing, yet authoritative voice you can trust, who also shares your passion for true crime and sleep hygiene. And that's me. So you can subscribe to this show on Patreon, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. And the nice thing about not having any ads is we can dive straight into the story. And our story starts just a few days ago, on August 13th, 2024. When a woman stood on the steps of Los Angeles' City Hall and delivered a prepared statement to a small crowd that had gathered around her. This woman, she wasn't a politician. She'd come all the way from South Carolina, demanding the attention of the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass. Mayor Bass had just returned from a phenomenal trip to Paris. If you watched the Olympic stage at the closing ceremonies, you would have seen her. She looked stunning in a striking red dress and black sling-back heels, standing on stage with Simone Biles and other world-famous athletes and performers. As the first Black woman to be mayor of Los Angeles, she was making history on that stage. On TV, she had a warm smile as she proudly waved the Olympic flag. She was there for the official handoff from Paris to LA in anticipation of the next Summer Olympics to be held right here in Los Angeles in 2028. It wasn't clear if Karen Bass was aware of this woman standing on the steps of City Hall, demanding to be heard. But it didn't matter. This woman, she was a mother. And she wasn't going to go away. She wanted justice. And that started with making sure everyone knew her son's name. His name was Johnny Wactor. Johnny was a 37-year-old professional actor who was, by all accounts, a sweet, hardworking, and generous guy. His career included a recurring role on the daytime soap opera General Hospital, until his character was killed off in 2022. He also appeared in a handful of primetime TV shows along with several independent films, with plans to dive into screenwriting next. Blonde, blue-eyed, and handsome, his was a familiar trajectory for the non-Nepo performers out there. The aspiring actor's classic arc. It's a hero's journey of battling the nearly impossible odds of making it in Hollywood, where every role is fought for, every part hard-won. Like a lot of actors, it seemed Johnny had just enough to keep him going, to keep the dream alive, but not quite enough yet to make a living. At least not without some supplemental income to pay the bills. Since the dawn of Hollywood, for actors like Johnny, the service industry is the best way to make a little cash until you get your big break. Johnny likely hoped one day, soon, people would know his name. Just not like this. Johnny tended bar at a place called Level 8. It was called Level 8 because the bar where he worked was located on the 8th floor of a hotel called the Moxie downtown LA. Now, the Moxie was actually a Marriott, kind of rebranded and jazzed up to look boutiquey. And it worked. The place was busy. And the bar, it looked like a lot of fun. In one of the photos online, there's a young woman who looks like she stepped out of the golden age of Hollywood. She wears a sparkly costume and a top hat, and somehow perched gracefully on a giant chandelier. That, to me, is LA at its best. A glamorous fantasy, the dream within a dream. Dancing in the swirling glow of a giant chandelier, the music never stops, the champagne flows, the party never ends. Unseen, or at least somewhere in the shadows, 8 stories below, it was a different story. There was no music, no champagne. And in a few hours, the only sounds will be sounds of voices, men's voices shouting. Then the pop of a gun, fired at close range, the roar of an engine and the squeal of tires as a car tears away. And a voice crying out, "Honey, are you okay?" It was late Friday night, the wee hours of Saturday morning, in late May of 2024, the beginning of the long Memorial Day weekend. Most bars in LA close at around 2. Then it usually takes about an hour or so to clean up everything, count your tips, sit for a beat with your coworkers and decompress, and then head home, where, hopefully, exhausted, you can have a nice, long sleep. It was just after 3 in the morning when Johnny and one of his coworkers, a friend, had left the bar and were heading to their parked cars on a street in downtown Los Angeles. According to police reports featured in the LA Times, which I'll link to in the show notes, Johnny was walking his coworker to her car, but along the way he noticed something was going on with his car. There were 3 men maneuvering around it in a strange way. Much to his surprise and dismay, Johnny's car was being towed. Well, at first glance, that's what it looked like. As he drew closer, he realized something was off. If his car was being towed, where was the tow truck? But there was no tow truck, just a sedan, an Infiniti Q50, idling nearby. Right, so if the 3 men around his car weren't a towing service, what were these 3 guys up to? They were thieves, and they were hard at work taking something from his car. Not the inside, but the underneath. Johnny likely didn't know what it was exactly they were after. Unless you've been targeted, you typically don't. But whatever it was, Johnny wasn't going to fight them for it. His friend later told police that Johnny raised his hands, letting them know he didn't want any trouble. But it was too late. Trouble was already in motion. It all happened very quickly. One of the 3 men drew a gun. Johnny stood in front of his friend to protect her. And then a single pop. Johnny was shot in the chest at close range. Johnny fell back into his friend's arms. In shock, his friend asked him, "Honey, are you okay?" To which Johnny replied, "Nope, I've been shot." By then, the 3 men had jumped into their Infiniti Q50, which was apparently stolen, and sped away. A nearby security guard heard the commotion, then called 911. Johnny was taken to the hospital, but he didn't survive. When news broke about the slaying of Johnny Wactor, people were stunned. They were shocked because of who he was and what had happened, of course. But they were also shocked because of what these thieves were after, the motive, the object that was so desirable that it was worth killing for. In a previous episode called 6 Degrees of Birkin, you'll remember that we followed a ring of South American criminal tourists who broke into people's houses and stole luxury handbags. That made sense. Those handbags were worth thousands of dollars. And more recently, a pair of alleged criminal tourists robbed a man at gunpoint for his $1 million Patek Philippe watch. What these men were after, what they were willing to kill for, was an item found everywhere. It was a part of a car. A metal cylinder about the size of a loaf of bread, called a catalytic converter, also known as a CAT. To understand why someone would kill another person to get their hands on a CAT, it would help to understand what a catalytic converter is and how it became so valuable that people were willing to kill for it. Now, this is going to get pretty dead sleepy because catalytic converters are not the sexy part of a car. So I thought I would try what we did in the previous episode when we learned about ChatGPT, generative AI and machine learning. I'm going to take a few minutes to explain it, along with some soothing, meditative tones that offer the potential benefit of having a restorative and relaxing impact on your mind. So if you don't have a great interest in the mechanics of a catalytic converter or emerging black market secondary economies that come from a disrupted supply chain, no problem. You can still enjoy the added benefit of these relaxing tones. Are you ready? So catalytic converters, CATs, have been around since the 1970s, when in an effort to curb carbon emissions and make for cleaner air, catalytic converters, CATs, were added to car engines to function like an engine's Brita filter. For a piece of metal about the size of a giant Stanley water bottle, CATs made a huge difference in the air quality, especially here in Los Angeles, which up until that point, in the 1970s, was pretty dirty. If you look at old photos, you can see this kind of tobacco-stained halo around LA from all the cars and all of those unpurified emissions. So the catalytic converter essentially is a step in between what the engine does and what comes out of your tailpipe. Kind of like a heat-generated scrubbing bubbles that ensures cleaner air. Inside those CATs is something like a honeycomb. And inside those honeycombs are precious metals. Durable, long-lasting metals that can generate and withstand high heat. This includes 3 sought-after valuable metals called platinum, palladium, and rhodium. Now, CATs have been around for a long time. So why all of a sudden were people interested in stealing them now and willing to kill someone for them? Well, there were 2 factors at play. The epidemic of CAT theft came from the pandemic. At the time, disrupted supply chains because of COVID created a demand, one that couldn't be met. You'll remember how expensive cars were, and metal parts were hard to find. And since most people were inside and not driving their cars, major cities that have a lot of cars, like Los Angeles, became easy pickings or thieves who could get in and out and steal a catalytic converter from under a car within a matter of seconds. Then resell those cats to either unknowing or unscrupulous scrap buyers that paid good money, a few $100, sometimes up to $1,000, cash. Another part of the appeal of stealing a cat is that they're hard to trace. There's no serial number that would connect someone's cat to a car. And catalytic converters can't be reused, so it wouldn't be like someone would buy a catalytic converter to then put it in another car. It doesn't work like that, and it's illegal. So the only reason why someone would buy a used cat would be for the value of those precious metals found inside. The desired parts were just a few ounces, a few grams of those precious metals. That's rhodium, palladium, and platinum. Believe it or not, rhodium is one of the most, if not the most, valuable precious metal on Earth, worth more than gold. Once a cat is stolen, it moves fast, from the thief to the buyer, and then into what's called the circular automotive economy. A circular economy is usually good. It means that it makes a process of creating something like a car more sustainable because you're reusing parts. But in this instance, with a catalytic converter, those precious metals have become so valuable that people are willing to do anything to steal them, especially because they can do it really, really fast with just a tire jack and a saw. I saw it myself. One time when I was walking my dog at around 6 a.m, there was a man about a half block down the street underneath the car, which I assumed was his. He jacked up one side of the car, which was a Honda Civic, and it just looked like he was trying to fix it somehow. I didn't pay much attention. And what seemed like seconds later, a van pulled up, that guy got in, and they were gone. And the harshest part in all this, the cats that are stolen aren't from expensive cars with owners who can afford the loss. They're almost always taken from older cars, in particular Prius models from the mid-2000s, 2004 to 2009. The old cats in older hybrids have a higher concentration of those precious metals. So the victims are usually people who have to park on the street, people who are working to get by, and they don't have a lot of money to replace those catalytic converters, in some cases more than once. Most of the time, people are annoyed that they have to pay a few $1,000s to get it replaced. But on a few tragic occasions, people have had to pay with their lives. It was 4 o'clock in the morning in early October of 2022 when the police in Oakland, California, outside of San Francisco, received a 911 call about someone trying to steal a catalytic converter outside of someone's house in the neighborhood of Glenview. Minutes after that, a flood of 911 calls. This time, they were reporting a shooting that had happened outside of that same house. The victim was a 60-year-old man, a father, who dashed outside to find out what was going on with his car. The thieves had made off with the catalytic converter. But as they drove away, one of the thieves stuck a gun out of an open car window and shot and killed the man. And that was what was so heartbreaking for his family. They already had what they came for. Why did they need to kill someone? Back in Los Angeles, the friends and family of Johnny Wactor thought the same thing. Those 3 thieves had already stolen the catalytic converter. Johnny had proven he wasn't a threat. Why did they have to kill him? Two and a half months after her son was slain in the street, Johnny's mother had a more urgent question now. Why hadn't they caught the men who killed her son yet? She wanted answers from the mayor, Karen Bass. In the beginning, just days after the murder, it seemed like investigators had promising leads. They'd found some security video that included footage of the three men jumping into that Infiniti Q50, their getaway car. Unfortunately, the video footage, at least what they released to the public, it was grainy, and it was shot from afar, and you couldn't see faces. No way. It was dark, and their figures were shadows, illuminated only by the red brake lights of their car, just before it pulled away. They did have one crucial piece of information, that one of the suspects had a tattoo, a distinct tattoo over his left eyebrow. They also found fingerprints at the crime scene, including fingerprints under Johnny's car, where the cat was stolen. Of course, authorities hoped that these fingerprints would lead to their suspects, but there was no guarantee. Authorities also offered a $25,000 reward for anyone who had information on these potential suspects that would lead to their capture. But over those weeks, nothing concrete had happened. Johnny's friends and family were doing what families of murder victims are supposed to do: keep his name and face in the news. And just a couple of days after his mother stood on the steps of City Hall demanding answers from Mayor Karen Bass, there was even bigger news. It seemed like it was out of the blue, but it wasn't. The LAPD announced they'd zeroed in on some key suspects. And while Johnny's mother had demanded that LA Mayor Karen Bass pay attention to this case, there was actually another famous Angelino who was at the Paris Olympics, and he was quite a hit. One who had an unexpected connection to this case. It was distant, but it was there, if you knew how to look closely enough. He wasn't an athlete. He was one of our most beloved personalities, celebrities, and rap stars. The D-O-double-G, Snoop Dogg. It feels like ancient history, but it's true. Before Snoop Dogg was an international sensation and the global crowd pleaser at this year's Olympics, before he was best friends with Martha Stewart, before he had brand deals with Corona and his own varietal of red wine in the supermarket, hitmaker Snoop Dogg was in his earliest days. Back when he was a teenager, he was a Crip. And that gang affiliation, his affiliation with the Crips, it seems almost cute now. If I recall correctly, he even did his own jaunty little Crip walk at the Super Bowl a few years ago, carving the letters C-R-I-P with his long legs as he made his way across the stage. He might have even taught Ellen how to do the C-walk on daytime TV. It's hard to remember that there was a time decades ago when gangster rap was this terrible threat. And even as far back as the early 90s, Snoop Dogg said that he wasn't really a Crip. This gang affiliation was put on him by the media and by police. It was something he tried out when he was a kid and gave up by the time he was 18. And all these years later, gangster rap is appreciated as a style of music, as a brand. It was even performed at the end of the Olympic ceremonies, with Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg on stage in Long Beach, performing their greatest hits. These two guys we grew up with, looking like our cool uncles. And the way that most of us feel about gangster rap reminds me about what people say is wrong with true crime. That it's a genre that's become so popular as entertainment, we've forgotten that there are real people. There are real crimes, real perpetrators, and real victims. In pop culture, we know about the Crips and the Bloods. And both of those gangs were most powerful in the 80s and the early 90s. But it's not like that anymore. But there are still gangs in Los Angeles, quite a few of them. And there's one that's been around even longer than the Crips and the Bloods. A gang you may not have heard of, but one that's more powerful and more dangerous and more violent than ever. And it's the gang at the heart of the murder of Johnny Wactor. You likely know the gang MS-13. But long before that, there was Florencia 13. Named after the avenue, Florence Avenue, in South LA, that was one portion of the territory that the Florencia 13 considered theirs. For most of that time, from the 70s and 80s and 90s, the Crips and the Bloods kept control of that area, but there were always enclaves of these Hispanic gangs. And one that would emerge as most powerful in the 2000s and right up until now is Florencia 13. Back in the 1950s, the Florence 13 gang even had their own song. The song was called Florence by the Paragons. It's an old doo-wop tune that you might actually know from Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets. But decades before that, it was the anthem of the Florence 13 gang. A song played at just about every baptism, wedding, and funeral of those connected to the Florencia 13. And there were many. At one point in its history, Florencia 13 counted 2,000 members, a collective of various smaller gangs, all unified within this one gang. Florencia 13 works a lot like how you imagine the Italian mafia. They collect taxes. And for years, they collected taxes on just about every business in their territory. There's obviously a lot more to this history, decades and decades. And I'm going to share a link by a journalist named Sam Quinones, who wrote a fascinating piece on the history of F-13 for Los Angeles Magazine back in 2017. Authorities have been trying to take down F-13 for years, for almost a century. Generations and generations of cops up against generations and generations of gang members. Which was why what happened in mid-August just a few days ago was such a big deal. the 4 men accused of taking part in the murder of Johnny Wactor. They were and are alleged members of the Florencia 13 gang. And I say 4 men, but they are boys. 18 years old. It just so happened that around the same time as authorities announced the arrest of 4 men potentially involved with the murder of Johnny Wactor, that there was another announcement. The unsealing of federal grand jury indictments charging 37 members and associates of F-13, alleging their involvement in scores of crimes, including fentanyl trafficking, extortion, 3 murders, including a man who was apparently beaten to death outside of a bar because he was in the gang's territory. Law enforcement seized 21 pounds of methamphetamine, 9 pounds of fentanyl, 6.5 pounds of heroin, and seized 25 firearms, along with roughly $70,000 in cash. And the theft of that catalytic converter was small change compared to the usual stuff that F-13 was involved with. They were just 4 specks of dust, 4 ants in a much larger enterprise. And what was supposed to be a 90-second task turned into murder. And perhaps the shooting of Johnny Wactor was just par for the course. A young gang member getting his feet wet. And the next steps would logically be a murder trial. When that will be, it's unclear. This was all just announced a few days ago. And authorities will have their hands full with all of the other cases that have been brought against F-13. So, Johnny's murder has been technically solved, though the saga is far from over. And all of it, all of that death and destruction and lives ruined over a few ounces of metal sold off for scrap. Metal considered more precious than one man's life. And there's an interesting postscript in this story. Earlier in the episode, I mentioned 2 men believed to be South American criminal tourists held up another man for his watch, his Patek Philippe. Well, those 2 men were just arrested. The handgun that was recovered at the Airbnb, strangely, inexplicably, was registered to Christopher Dorner. Christopher Dorner, as you likely know, was a former member of the LAPD who, in 2013, went on a killing spree before he himself was shot dead by police in a standoff in a cabin up in Big Bear. So how did 2 alleged criminal tourists from Colombia end up with the gun of Chris Dorner? It is a real mystery. One that we might explore in a future episode of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. Until then, nighty-night.